Harmony Creek was a picture-perfect town, but behind the manicured lawns and razor-thin smiles lay a darkness that threatened to consume anyone who dared to be different. I was about to find out just how far they'd go to keep their world perfectly gray. They say the quietest towns have the loudest secrets. I never believed that until my mom and I moved to Harmony Creek. The name itself should have been a red flag. It sounded like something you'd see on a postcard from a time that never really existed. The houses were all painted in muted, approved-upon colors. The lawns were greener than a freshly printed dollar bill, and the smiles from the neighbors were as wide and thin as a razor's edge. For the first few months, I tried to play their game. Yes, Mrs. Gable. No, Mr. Henderson. Of course, I'll take our trash cans in the second the truck turns the corner. I was the good kid, the quiet kid, the only black kid in a sea of perfectly pleasant, perfectly pale faces. My dad passed away a year before the move. He was an artist, a man who saw color and life in everything. Our old yard was what he called his canvas of chaos, a beautiful mess of wildflowers, strange metal sculptures he'd welded together, and a wind chime made of old silver forks that sang every time the wind blew. He used to say, "Marcus, never let anyone paint your world in shades of gray." Harmony Creek was the grayest place I'd ever seen. The Homeowners Association, run by the aforementioned Mrs. Gable, had rules for everything. The acceptable height of your grass, the approved model of your mailbox, even the specific type of seasonal wreath you were allowed to hang on your door. It was a meticulously curated museum of mediocrity, and we were the new, slightly off-center exhibit everyone was pretending not to stare at. The whispers followed me like a shadow. I'd hear them when I was getting the mail, see them in the twitch of a curtain as I walked home from the bus stop. They weren't loud, they weren't aggressive, they were worse. They were polite. "Oh, his mother is a widow, you know. He's always so quiet. I wonder where they're from." They were dissecting me, piece by piece, with their pleasantries. My mom felt it too. She'd come home from her nursing job, her shoulders a little more slumped each day, and force a smile that didn't quite reach her tired eyes. We were trying to build a new life on a foundation of polite prejudice, and the cracks were already starting to show. The breaking point for me wasn't some grand dramatic event. It was a letter, a beige envelope with the Harmony Creek HOA logo embossed in the corner, slipped neatly into our officially sanctioned mailbox. It was a warning. Our garden gnome, a goofy little thing my dad had painted to look like Jimi Hendrix, was in violation of Bylaw 7, Section 4. Lawn ornaments must be of a classical or pastoral nature and not exceed 12 inches in height. My dad's last gift to me, his last little piece of joyful rebellion, was an aesthetic violation. I stood there on my perfectly manicured lawn, holding that sterile piece of paper, and I felt something snap. My dad's voice echoed in my head. "Never let them paint your world gray." That night, I didn't sleep. I went into the garage and found his old gardening tools and a sketchbook filled with his designs. An idea began to form, a seed of defiance planted in the fertile ground of my anger and grief. It wasn't going to be loud or destructive. It was going to be beautiful. It was going to be a tribute. And it was going to break every single one of their stupid, gray rules. I spent the next 2 weeks working from sunrise to sunset. I tore up a huge, crescent-shaped piece of our prize-winning lawn. I brought in river stones, smooth and dark, and arranged them in a pattern that mirrored the kente cloth my grandmother had given me. I didn't plant neat rows of petunias or tulips. I planted blood-red canna lilies that looked like flames, deep purple African irises, and bright yellow goldenrods that the HOA considered weeds. I built a small water feature from an old ceramic pot, so it made a soft gurgling sound, a constant whisper of life. It wasn't just a garden, it was a story. My story. My dad's story. It was everything Harmony Creek wasn't. It was bold, it was vibrant, and it was unapologetically black. The reaction was immediate. The whispers turned into open stares. Cars would slow down as they drove past my house. I saw Mrs. Gable standing on her porch across the street, her arms crossed, her face a mask of pinched fury. Another beige envelope arrived, this one citing a dozen new violations. Unapproved landscaping materials, alteration of lawn topography, non-native plant species. I used the letter as kindling for the small fire pit I'd built in the center of the garden. I was done playing their game. This was my home, my land, and my father's memory. They couldn't regulate that. The next Saturday morning, I was kneeling in the dirt, tending to the irises, when a shadow fell over me. I looked up. It was Mrs. Gable, but she wasn't alone. Behind her, stretching down the sidewalk, was half the neighborhood. Mr. Henderson, the retired cop from next door, the Miller family whose kids I sometimes saw playing. They stood there, silent, a crowd of blank faces and crossed arms. Mrs. Gable held a clipboard like a weapon. Her voice was cold, stripped of all its fake pleasantry. "Mr. Washington," she said, not even looking at my garden, but staring directly into my eyes. "This is your final official notice. You have 24 hours to remove this eyesore and restore your lawn to its original approved condition." She paused, letting the weight of the silent crowd press down on me. "Or we will." I stayed kneeling for a long moment, the sun warm on my back, the damp earth cool under my knees. I could feel every eye on me, a physical weight. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against their wall of silence. I took a deep breath, smelling the rich soil and the sweet scent of the irises. I slowly rose to my feet, wiping the dirt from my hands onto my jeans. I looked past Mrs. Gable, making eye contact with as many of her silent followers as I could. I saw Mr. Henderson avoid my gaze, his lips a thin, unhappy line. I saw one of the Miller kids staring at the blood-red canna lilies with wide, curious eyes before his mother tugged him back. They weren't a mob. They were a flock, and Mrs. Gable was their shepherd. "With all due respect, Mrs. Gable," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "This isn't an eyesore. It's a memorial." A ripple of murmurs went through the crowd. I pressed on, my voice growing stronger. "My father was an artist. He loved color and life. He hated beige." I gestured to the beige letter she'd sent, still sitting on my porch steps. "He passed away last year. This is for him. Every plant, every stone is a piece of his memory. You're not asking me to restore a lawn. You're asking me to tear down my father's headstone." The silence that followed was different. It was heavy, uncomfortable. I had taken their neat little bylaw violation and turned it into something they couldn't just file away. I had made it about grief, about family, about love, things that even Harmony Creek's rulebook didn't have a section for. Mrs. Gable's face tightened. For a second I thought I saw a flicker of something human in her eyes, but it was gone as quickly as it came. She adjusted the clipboard in her hands, her shield of authority. "That is unfortunate," she said, the words clipped and sterile. "But the community has standards. Rules are in place for the benefit of everyone's property values. Your personal circumstances don't grant you an exemption. 24 hours, Mr. Washington. 9 a.m. tomorrow." She turned on her heel with military precision, and her flock, after a moment's hesitation, turned and followed, their footfalls on the perfect sidewalk echoing in the quiet morning air. I stood there until the last one had disappeared back into their perfectly painted house. Then I sank back down onto my knees, the strength leaving my legs. They were actually going to do it. They were going to come here with shovels and rakes and rip my father's memory out of the ground. I felt a hot surge of anger, followed by a cold wave of despair. My dad always said to fight gray with color. But how could I fight this? A whole town of gray. I pulled out my phone and called my mom. I explained everything, my voice cracking. She was quiet for a long time on the other end of the line. I could hear the hum of the machines at the hospital where she worked. "Oh, baby," she finally whispered. "I'm so sorry." She told me to be careful, to not get myself into trouble. But then, just before she hung up, she added, "Marcus, do what you think is right. Be smart, but do what your father would have done. Do what my father would have done. He wouldn't have met their anger with more anger. He wouldn't have tried to fight them with force. He would have flipped the whole script. He would have invited them in." An idea, wild and terrifying and beautiful, sparked in my mind. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but it was the most dad thing I could think of. I spent the rest of the day on my laptop, not looking up HOA bylaws or legal loopholes, but scrolling through my dad's old email contacts and social media pages. I sent dozens of messages. I made phone calls to numbers I hadn't dialed in over a year, my voice shaking at first, then growing more confident with each call. I told them what was happening. I told them what the garden meant. And then I invited them. That night, under the glow of the porch light, I didn't tear anything down. I built something. I found an old piece of plywood in the garage, and using my dad's paints, I wrote in his big, joyful script, "The James Washington Memorial Garden. All are welcome." I hammered it into the ground at the edge of the stone path. I brought out every folding chair we owned. I went inside and made 2 giant pitchers of sweet tea and a pot of coffee, just like my mom did whenever company was coming over. I was up all night, my mind racing. I didn't know if anyone would come. I didn't know if it would work. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like my dad was right there with me, a hand on my shoulder, whispering, "That's it, son. Paint your world." The sun rose, casting long shadows across the dew-covered lawns of Harmony Creek. 8:55 a.m. I stood by my sign, my heart thumping a slow, heavy rhythm. Then I heard it. The sound of cars stopping, doors closing, the low murmur of voices and the scrape of footsteps on the sidewalk. Mrs. Gable was here, and she had brought her volunteers. I saw them round the corner, a determined-looking group of about 10 neighbors, Mr. Henderson among them. They were carrying shovels, heavy-duty gardening gloves, and large empty yard bags. They were dressed for demolition. They marched toward my house, their faces set with grim purpose, and then, all at once, they stopped. Their steps faltered. The shovels in their hands suddenly seemed to droop. Mrs. Gable's mouth fell open slightly. Because I wasn't alone. Sitting in the folding chairs, standing on the sidewalk, sipping coffee, and talking quietly amongst themselves, were about 30 other people. They were my dad's people. Black, white, brown, artists with paint-splattered jeans, musicians with instrument cases, poets and welders and dreamers. They had all driven hours to be here, and they were all looking right back at the demolition crew, their expressions not angry, but simply waiting. The silence was deafening. It stretched between the 2 groups like a taut wire, a chasm separating 2 completely different worlds on one suburban street. On one side stood Harmony Creek's finest, armed with tools of erasure, their faces a mixture of confusion and indignation. On the other side, my father's legacy, a vibrant, eclectic mosaic of humanity, holding paper cups of coffee instead of weapons. They weren't there to fight. They were there to bear witness. Mrs. Gable was the first to recover. Her eyes, thin and sharp, swept over the crowd, dismissing them as an inconvenient, foreign art installation. She marched forward, clipboard in hand, stopping a few feet from the plywood sign. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, her voice tight with fury. Her gaze landed on me. "I gave you a deadline, Mr. Washington. This gathering does not change the fact that you are in violation of community bylaws." Before I could answer, a man with a wild gray beard and a tie-dye shirt stepped forward. He was one of my dad's oldest friends, a sculptor named Leo. "Ma'am," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle but firm, "we're here to pay our respects. This isn't just a garden. It's a living piece of art made by a friend we all love dearly. You can't just weed it." "This is private property," Mrs. Gable snapped, her face flushing a blotchy red. "And you people are trespassing." "Actually," a calm voice cut in. It came from a woman in a sharp business suit I recognized as one of my dad's former gallery representatives, a lawyer named Miss Diaz. She took a step forward, holding her phone. "Marcus is the property owner, and he has invited us here as his guests. Technically, it is you and your associates who are on the verge of trespassing and threatening destruction of private property. A property, I might add, that could be considered a work of art with significant sentimental and perhaps even monetary value." Mrs. Gable looked like she had swallowed a wasp. The word monetary hung in the air, a concept Harmony Creek understood far better than sentimental. The volunteers behind her shifted uncomfortably. They had signed up to pull some weeds and teach the new kid a lesson, not to get tangled up in a potential lawsuit. Mr. Henderson, my next-door neighbor, lowered his shovel a few inches, his gaze fixed on the ground. I could see the conflict warring on his face. I decided it was my turn to speak. "They aren't just guests, Mrs. Gable," I said, my voice carrying in the still morning air. "They're here to help. See, I realized you were right. This garden is a lot of work for one person to maintain. So I invited some friends over for a gardening day." I gestured to the crowd. "My dad taught all of us that the best way to honor something beautiful is to share it." I walked over to the porch and picked up a small stack of papers. I even printed out some information about the plants, in case any of the neighbors were curious. I held one out towards her. "This one is the canna lily. In some cultures, it symbolizes confidence and hope. This is the African iris. It represents wisdom." My little speech seemed to drain all the fight out of her. She stared at the paper in my hand as if it were a snake. She looked at her dwindling army of volunteers, who now looked more like a confused group of men holding farm equipment. She looked at the diverse, smiling faces of my father's friends. Her meticulously ordered world, governed by rules and regulations, was being invaded by something she couldn't control. Genuine, messy, colorful humanity. She was outnumbered. Without another word, she spun around and marched back down the street, her back as stiff and unyielding as a telephone pole. Her volunteers, looking deeply relieved, quickly followed, their shovels now pointing awkwardly at the ground. It was a silent, clumsy retreat. A cheer went up from my dad's friends. Leo clapped me on the back so hard I stumbled. "Ms." Diaz gave me a crisp, approving nod. For the rest of the morning, it was like a festival on my front lawn. My dad's friends told stories about him, laughing until tears streamed down their faces. A musician friend pulled out a guitar and started playing soft blues. People from the crowd I'd never met before came up to me, shook my hand, and told me how much my father's art had meant to them. And then, something even more surprising happened. A few of the neighbors, the ones who had been part of the silent flock, started to drift over. First it was the Miller kids, drawn by the music. Then their mother followed, looking hesitant. I offered her a cup of coffee. She took it, her eyes scanning the garden, not with disapproval, but with a dawning curiosity. She asked me about the river stones. A little while later, another neighbor came over and shyly admitted he'd always wanted to plant something other than boxwoods. By lunchtime, my front yard was filled with a mix of old friends and new neighbors, all mingling, talking, and looking at the garden, not as a violation, but as a landmark. It felt like a victory. That evening, as the last of my dad's friends drove away, my mom got home from her shift. She pulled into the driveway and just sat in her car for a long minute, looking at the scene. The plywood sign, the empty coffee cups, and the garden, which seemed to glow in the twilight. When she got out, her eyes were shining. "You did what your father would have done," she said, her voice thick with emotion as she wrapped me in a hug. "You filled this gray place with color." We stood there for a while, just breathing it all in. The war, I thought, was over. I had won. But as we turned to go inside, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Mr. Henderson, my next-door neighbor, was standing in his own yard. He wasn't looking at me. He was staring intently at the base of my house, his face pale, and his expression one of pure, unadulterated horror. He slowly lifted a trembling hand and pointed. "Marcus," he choked out, his voice barely a whisper. "You need to see this." I followed Mr. Henderson's trembling finger, my heart sinking with a dreadful premonition. My eyes traced the line from his hand to the foundation of my house, right where the new garden bed met the pale yellow siding. And then I saw it. It wasn't a crack in the foundation or some structural damage. It was worse. Spreading out from the damp soil, climbing the wall like a sinister vine, was a dark, ugly stain. It was thick, patchy, and had a sickly sheen in the fading light. It looked like the house was bleeding. "What is that?" my mom whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. Mr. Henderson took a hesitant step closer. "That's black mold," he said, his voice grim. "Bigotries, the bad kind. I used to see it all the time on the force, in neglected properties. Your new garden, all that water you've been using for the feature, the disturbed soil, right up against the house. You must have given it the perfect conditions to grow, and it grows fast." The victory I had felt just moments before evaporated, replaced by a cold, sickening dread. Mrs. Gable and her HOA hadn't won by force, but I might have just handed them the victory on a silver platter. A black mold infestation wasn't a violation of a subjective aesthetic bylaw. It was a genuine health hazard, a structural threat. They could condemn the house. They would have every right to force me to rip out the garden, to bring in professionals in hazmat suits. The memorial would be destroyed, not out of prejudice, but out of necessity. All my defiance, all the beautiful color I had brought to this gray street would be poisoned from the inside out. My father's garden wouldn't be a symbol of life. It would be the source of a toxic blight. Word spread through Harmony Creek faster than the mold itself. By the next morning, Mrs. Gable was on my doorstep, but her expression wasn't triumphant. It was something more complex, a mixture of grim satisfaction and what looked almost like concern. "I've called an emergency inspector," she announced, foregoing any pleasantries. "They'll be here this afternoon." She wasn't gloating. This was bigger than her rules now. This was a threat to the sterile perfection of her entire neighborhood. The whole street was buzzing. Neighbors who had been curious and friendly the day before now looked at my house with fear, as if the mold spores might drift on the wind and infect their own perfect homes. The battle I thought I had won was lost. I had fought their rules, but I couldn't fight biology. I spent the morning in a daze, staring at the spreading stain on my house. It felt like a physical manifestation of all the ugliness I had tried to push back against. I was sitting on the porch steps, head in my hands, when a car door slammed. I looked up to see Mr. Henderson walking across his lawn towards me. He was holding a power washer and a large bucket filled with cleaning supplies. "My son works in remediation," he said, his voice gruff, avoiding my eyes. "He told me what to use. It's a long shot, and you'll still need the inspector to sign off, but we can try to get ahead of it." I was stunned into silence. Before I could respond, another neighbor, the man who had been interested in planting boxwoods, appeared with a set of heavy-duty scrapers. Then the Miller family arrived, equipped with masks and rubber gloves. One by one, they came. The same neighbors who had stood behind Mrs. Gable with shovels were now standing in my yard with buckets and brushes. Mrs. Gable stood on her porch, watching, her arms crossed. She didn't move to stop them. She just watched as this quiet, unassuming man who had been a police officer, this family with 2 young kids, this whole neighborhood of people chose to help. They weren't just helping me save my house, they were helping me save my father's memorial. We worked all morning, a strange, silent team. We scrubbed and scraped and sprayed. Mr. Henderson showed me how to mix the powerful cleaning solution, his movements precise and practiced. Mrs. Miller handed out water bottles. Her kids, too young to help with the chemicals, started pulling the few weeds that had sprouted at the edge of the garden, their small hands tending to the memorial. When the inspector arrived, he found a spotless foundation and a dozen neighbors standing around my garden, their clothes stained with dirt and cleaner. He did a thorough check, taking moisture readings and samples. He confirmed Mr. Henderson's diagnosis. It had been a nasty, aggressive strain of Stachybotrys. "But," the inspector said, looking from the clean wall to the assembled crowd, "it appears you've caught it early and remediated it perfectly. There's no trace of it left. I'd advise putting in a proper stone barrier between the garden bed and the house to prevent it from happening again. But as of now, this house is clean." A collective sigh of relief went through our small crowd. That afternoon, Mr. Henderson helped me dig a small trench and lay a border of thick paving stones between the garden and the house, creating the barrier the inspector suggested. As we finished, Mrs. Gable walked across the street. She stood at the edge of the garden, looking at the vibrant flowers, the kente cloth pattern of the stones, and the new protective border. She looked tired. "The bylaws," she said softly, almost to herself. "Don't say anything about a memorial garden." She looked at me, and for the first time, I saw the person underneath the HOA president. "Your father would be proud, Marcus." She then turned and walked back to her house. It wasn't an apology, not really. But it was an armistice. It was an acceptance. Harmony Creek is still a quiet town. The lawns are still impeccably manicured. The mailboxes still uniform. But something has shifted. My garden is still there, brighter and more colorful than ever. Sometimes I see neighbors slow down as they pass, Not to stare, but to admire. The Miller kids come over to help me water the plants sometimes. Mr. Henderson and I now talk over the fence about more than just the weather. I didn't teach the town a lesson with anger or a grand speech. The lesson came when the vibrant, beautiful thing I created developed a flaw, a sickness. It was only then, when my colorful world was threatened by a patch of ugly darkness, that the people living in their gray houses came out to help me save it. They learned tolerance not from my strength, but from my vulnerability. And I learned that even in the grayest of places, if you plant something with enough love, something beautiful and something colorful will eventually grow.